Okay, so welcome to Drupal 8 Drupal 8 migration strategy, how to be a resource for your team during a website migration. First, a little bit about myself. My name is Lynne Walsh. I'm a senior technical content strategist at Chief. We are a digital agency in DuPont Circle. My specialty there is to help facilitate website migrations for Drupal 7, Drupal 8, WordPress websites. What that really means is that I do database analysis, and using those findings, I make sure the information structure that we build can handle the data that needs to live there. I work with clients to understand their needs. I work with content strategists to make sure that the messaging recommendations that they're making have a place in the new site. And I work with developers to map the migration and then QA. But before we get into the weeds of the presentation, I'd like to get an idea of who's in the audience today. So how many of you have successfully migrated a website? Raise your hands. Okay. So how many of you are actively planning a website migration right now? Lots of hands, good. So when you first thought about your migration, how did you feel? So does this sound familiar? Overwhelmed, stressed, confused. These are all normal feelings when looking at a migration. I like to think of website migrations as a sort of inexact science, but some things are fundamental. So in this presentation, I want to break down my approach to website migration so that you can walk away feeling like you have the perspective you need to get your arms around your migration. So we're going to talk through the types of migrations out there and how to approach mapping it piece by piece. We'll go through the different methods of migration, how to decide the best one so that you can team up with your developer and be confident in the data that you're discussing. So take a breath, feel the feels, and then let it go, because you got this. So migrating a website is a lot like upgrading a piece of furniture. Say you buy a new bookshelf from West Elm, pricey bookshelf, for your favorite books. Your current bookshelf is made of that plywood stuff that bends over time and has started to crack with all its sagging. You're so excited about your new bookshelf, and it's time to move your beloved Harry Potter series to their new, sturdy, mahogany-scented home. But you realize some unexpected things. Your new bookshelf is 4 inches longer. It's got new sections in it. Your books aren't going to fit in it the same way that it used to. You realize you don't need to keep your books in the same order that you used to have them. You used to keep your Harry Potter series on the lower shelf, out of view, in case it broke and your books would be okay. But now you could have them front row center with these super cute little Quidditch themed bookends that you got from Etsy. You know, your bookshelf didn't have room for those in the past. And it's just in time for your Quidditch team housewarming party with all your friends. Website migrations are a great way to refresh your content and get the right stuff in front of the right people. But it takes a bit of planning to get it right. So where do we start? The inventory. Looking at a migration from a whole can be overwhelming. So I like to take it one piece at a time, starting with the inventory. I'm sure many of you are aware of what an inventory is, but for those of you who don't or want a refresher, we're going to go through the basics at a high level. An inventory in a library is a list of books and all the authors and the genres they fit in, maybe the reading level. Like an inventory for a library, an inventory for a website includes the count of URLs that are there, the taxonomy terms, how they're organized, the directories, how many site sections are there, how many user accounts exist, and how many files are present. As you think about your inventory, make sure to keep in mind anything your developer is going to need to move from one place to another will need to have a place in your inventory. It's this information that your developer will need to know so that you can create a mapping plan, which we'll talk about. But you can't map to something without knowing and understanding where it's coming from. So let's talk about how to compile your inventory. I like to focus on two things. We have the site database and the site crawl. Looking at the database, you can run queries to get counts of nodes, content types, taxonomy terms, images, user data, etc. To run a site crawl, there are lots of different site crawlers you can use. My personal favorite is Screaming Frog. But once you run a site crawl, you can compile a list of all the directories used, as well as all the files being linked to. Don't forget to compare your database data to your crawl. This will uncover any orphan pages. These are pages that exist in your database, but are not linked from the site and can be detrimental. So flag these to your team as well as your stakeholders so you can determine next steps and what to do with that. If you want to keep it, if you want to not keep it, what have you. Compiling this information and sharing it with your team as well as your stakeholders will help you understand what you're dealing with. Talking about these results will give you an idea of what's a priority so you can focus on your efforts on the most important parts first. So map it. Anything your developer will need to move should be clearly communicated to ensure that it has a clearly defined place in the new database. For our team, we found Spreadsheets to be helpful here. An effective mapping document should easily display the source fields from the source database, or CSV or feed, and then also what it needs to become in the new database. The more detail that's included in this document, the easier it will be for your developer to script it. So let's discuss putting a mapping spreadsheet together. Using the data you gathered from your inventory, start with the content types one at a time. In this example, I'm pulling the fields for a content type called lizards. As you can see, I've pulled the field names associated to my lizards content type into a spreadsheet. Each field should include as many details as possible, including the field label, the machine name, and any other details that your developer may need to know. The type of field is especially important for your developer to know since certain fields in Drupal 7 are treated differently in Drupal 8. Images, for example, may need to be stored using media, which is now part of Drupal 8 core. And pointing these fields out and talking about them so you can decide where they should go, what's the best place for them, can potentially mean your developer will need to spend some extra time mapping that data. By pulling it out early, you are flagging these items so that your dev can get ahead of the script that they'll need to write for it. So let's take a look at a sample mapping spreadsheet filled out. So over here we have the spreadsheet that we were just looking at. These are all of the fields of your legacy database. And then over here we have the fields from the new database in the new content type. You can clearly see where they're going left to right so that when your dev sits down to code it, he can see it. And it saves him time from going into the database themselves and doing all of this work for them. Using this spreadsheet, my dev can see the to and from aspects of the migration and can get started scripting without having to spend much time in the database. Similar spreadsheets can be used for taxonomy terms, user data, anything that you really need to map from one place to another. So the point here is that you don't need to be a developer to put this spreadsheet together. You really just need to know where to look. Here's an example of the fields list associated to the content type lizards in a Drupal 7 site. After logging in, you just navigate to the Manage Fields page for your content type, and you'll see your spreadsheet is pretty much laid out right there for you. So now we've discussed inventories and mapping, but let's talk a bit about deciding how to migrate your data. There are a number of different types of migration options. Many times the option will depend on the resourcing available on the team. Other times it will depend on the content type you're working with and the frequency at which it's being updated. So let's dig in. While migration by definition is moving data from one source to another, different sources can mean different ways to migrate. You can move data from your database to another database. You can move data from a database via API. You can move data stored within a CSV into a database. These are all different forms of scripted migration. And then there's always manual migration. Good old copy-paste, possibly the most time-consuming. But if strategically planned, it actually can save you time in the long run. The database-to-database scripted migration method is generally the most obvious choice when planning a migration. Your developer will write a script, generally a YAML file, which maps data from your legacy database into fields in your new database. These scripts will be rolled forwards and backwards to update content consistently several times over the course of your project. You can migrate from any type of database, Drupal 6, Drupal 7, even other types of databases like WordPress or proprietary databases. The complexity of the script will increase as the database, your source database, is less and less like a Drupal database, but it's not impossible. As long as your source and to fields are properly mapped, anything can be mapped this way. An API migration is mapped similarly, except using a different source, like JSON or XML, but the same concepts apply. Another way to script a migration is by CSV. In this method, data is stored within a CSV file, which acts as your source. Similar to a database migration, the data is still scripted via YAML file. However, instead of mapping fields to fields, you map columns within your CSV to fields in a new database. The nice thing about a CSV migration is that you can curate your content within a CSV before migrating it into a new database. This is helpful when you have a number of pages that are not frequently updated and you want to edit them all in one place before migrating them. Take leadership bios, for example. So you have a website with some leadership bios in it. There's 10 of them. Your client wants to edit all the bios beforehand, but they don't want to have to go into the database to edit them. They don't want to edit them on the site themselves. So you can pull these bios out of the legacy database, compile them into a CSV, share the CSV with them so that they can make their updates and send it back to you, and then you script the migration from the CSV into the new database. This is really helpful when you have content that's not updated that frequently. If you're using blogs that are added all the time, you'll end up spending all of your time keeping up with the blog content that they're adding. But something like a bio, something that's pretty stagnant, like you could just give them a CSV, they could update it, give it back to you, and you're done. CSV scripts are generally a little simpler. They're not as, you don't have to, the script that's used for them is a little less complex. So if you have a developer who doesn't have a lot of bandwidth, you can do it this way so that you still get your migration in, but your developer isn't overworked. Okay. So then we have the method which requires the least amount of developer support, manual migration. In my experience, manual migration is a part of every possible migration, be it a large, complex site or a small, simple one. It's why it's included in this presentation. This method comes with a lot of pros and cons, but at the end of the day, no amount of automation can compare to the human touch. So my personal general rule with manual migration is if the number of pages is less than 100, just manually migrate it. You don't need to get your developer to have to spend all this time to write a script. 100 things you can probably do in a couple of hours. Manual migration is often a better option for building landing pages and pages with custom code on it, things with calendars, embeds, and video, and unique layouts, because you can spend the time to build it once instead of scripting it, QAing it, making sure the script works, doing all this stuff. Sometimes it just saves you time to just put it in there yourself. But be strategic about it. So you want to do that for landing pages, but not blogs or not news, because there's so many more of those. When your developer has a lot on their plate, consider helping them out and migrate that data by hand. If you find yourself with a lot of strategists on your team and not so many devs, divide and conquer. So how do you choose? The pros and cons to each individual migration method. There are pros and cons, but ultimately the best decision is going to involve a little bit of each. But how much? Take it one section at a time. Organizing your migration plan by content type allows you to make decisions step by step and check off the content one at a time to make sure that you catch everything. So say we start with a blog content type and we see that the fields are consistent and that there's a high number of them. Scripting will probably be your best bet here. On the other hand, you have a page content type, generally used for a landing page, low in number, and varying with functionality. Assign this part to the content strategist to migrate while the developer is scripting the blogs. In some cases, you may even see places from your inventory where you can start as other site decisions are still being made. In one of my previous projects, we spent a lot of time going back and forth with the client to get a specific section of their site approved. But we knew off the bat that they wanted their blogs. So while the content strategists were working to get the site section in question approved, we moved forward with migrating the blogs, which saved us time, and we were able to kind of get ahead of our timeline. The takeaway here is to look back at your inventory, consider each content type, and make decisions from there. Resourcing. So while you're planning your migration, a lot of different factors need to be considered. We've talked about looking at the content in your inventory and thinking about what specifically you need to migrate. We've also talked about how to migrate it with the database to database or CSV or manually migrate it. Are you going to script it? Are you going to manually migrate it? Understanding your team, who's on your team, can determine the best migration method. One way to think about choosing a migration method is based off of the people on your team. So do you have a fully fledged team of back-end developers with previous experience in migration? Do you have a team of devs whose bandwidth is split between multiple projects? Do you have one developer, and a large team of content strategists? Resourcing can have a large effect on the type of migration for each content type. So look at each person on your team and think about migrating from there. So if your team is developer heavy with limited strategist support, consider scripting as much as you can. If your developer support is limited but present, rely on your strategists to handle some of the manual migration so that your dev can spend time where they're needed the most. Do you have a diverse team with lots of strategists, copy editors, UX, developers? Divide and conquer so that people can work in tandem and you don't have to do everything in a silo, so you can work in tandem and save time. So consider the rate. If you do manually migrate, be sure to think about how fast people can actually enter content. If your team is considering a good amount of manual migration, think about how long it takes you to manually migrate one page and do the math based off of how many pages you have. So think about it like, say it takes me 5 minutes to add a blog page and I have 20 blogs. So 20 times 5, do the math. This will help you work all of this time into your timeline so you can communicate it clearly with your stakeholders. You can communicate it clearly across your team, and everyone can be set on their expectations. But if you have a team of fully fledged devs, be sure to talk to them about whether they can recycle their code. A developer's history with migration can save time in the long run. Has your team scripted a migration before? A lot of migration scripts are based off of field types. For example, scripting a body field is pretty much the same for all sites. So you can, if your developer has written that script already, they can go back to that other project, grab that script, tweak it a bit for your project, and they don't have to start from scratch. So it saves you time. Consider putting together a library of all the scripts that your developers have written so that they can all refer to it and share code and collaborate. So while you're going through your inventory, talk to your developers about the migration scripts that they've run in the past, because it can save time. Which brings us to talking to your developer. While you're talking to them, make sure you're noting the types of fields in each content type. Scripting a plain text field is different than scripting a formatted text field. So call that out to your dev. For example, if you're scripting body content in one site and it has formatted inline styling, and you are scripting that into another body field, that you need to make sure to set that body field up to accept inline styling. Because if it doesn't, when you migrate it, all that style will be stripped out and you'll find it in QA, and you'll either have to put it in yourself or run the migration script again. So note any unique functionality that you find in your inventory. As a technical content strategist, it's my job to go through all of the legacy stuff. So I'm usually the one in the weeds finding wonky PHP code or calendars or iframes or lots of stuff that when you migrate it may not migrate well. So it's my job to flag it for my developer. And usually they appreciate it. So also note how the content is organized with taxonomy. So taxonomy can be used to organize content as well as structure it. So make sure there's a plan to either pull that functionality over to keep it in the new site, or have something in place to replace it so that your content is not lost. Discussing these elements as a team will ensure that everyone's on the same page and that you're choosing the best migration method for your project. With that said, any questions? I also have helpful resources after this slide, so I'll show you that.
Once you are getting through the migration, when it comes to QA, how much time do you spend looking at individual pages versus getting a big sense of how things have come over in general?
Usually to QA, after the migrations run, I get a copy of the database and pull out the migrated content into a spreadsheet. Not everybody does that, but it's the way I work really well in spreadsheets. So I look at the spreadsheet, I use VLOOKUP to compare that spreadsheet to my spreadsheet from my legacy database. Usually when you do it that way, you can see kind of holes in things. If something didn't migrate over, it either has like a null value or it's blank. So you can really see it easily in a spreadsheet. And from there, I do always spot check. So I do a spot check from the top of the spreadsheet, middle of the spreadsheet, bottom of the spreadsheet, because scripts pull things over sort of one at a time. So if something breaks, you want to check the stuff that came over in the beginning of the script and the things that came over at the end. Does that answer your question? Any other questions?
What about migrating from multiple sites into one site?
I didn't hear that. What?
What about migrating from multiple websites into one site?
So the question is, I should repeat this. what about migrating from multiple websites into one website? So I've done that a few times, and I've done it a few different ways. One time we pulled everything out into a CSV, and then we mapped it over that way, because in the CSV, okay, so I'll back up. One time we pulled everything out from the different websites into different CSVs, and then we combined the CSVs, and then we migrated that CSV into the database. There is another project that I helped out on where they did everything scripted. The problem when you do it that way, I think, is the IDs, the node IDs. If you script all the node IDs over, you need to create new node IDs, because they'll conflict. So if you have 3 sites and 3 pages, there's going to be 3 node 7s. So when you migrate it, that's not going to work. So you need to make sure you're aware of unique identifiers to make sure that there's no conflict. But it can be done. Yes?
Would you make some examples of the unique identifiers?
The question was, what are some examples of unique identifiers? So a node ID is one example. Taxonomy terms have unique IDs. Those are called TIDs. Then there's also unique identifiers for users, UIDs. But you can also, if you need to set something as a unique identifier, you can set different things. It doesn't always have to be the node ID. Generally, it's the easiest one. But sometimes you can set something like, if you think about it critically, you could set something like the title to be a unique identifier. I really wouldn't recommend doing that unless you know for a fact that everything's going to be different. Each title is different. But if you're in a situation where you need to, you can think critically about the other fields that you have, because you may be able to use them as a unique identifier.
And files, I'm assuming the assumption is that all the page assets go along with the node, like images, uploading PowerPoints, Excel files, whatever.
Yeah, so I think the question was about how to migrate files from a D7.
Do you do it separately or just with the content?
Well, it depends. So if you have, say you have a Drupal 7 site and the images for a content type there is stored in a file field, you can script that file field from a D7 site into a file field on the D8 site. But you do need to think about whether or not you want to use media on the D8 site. If you do, you would need to script that file into media, create a media entity, and then run another migration that would connect the media entity to the new content type in the new site. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I suspected it was going to be a little more complicated.
Yeah, you just have to think about several things, but sometimes the dependencies. So like what needs to exist in the site first in order for you to get things in as few times as possible. If you have files or images embedded within a body, that does get a lot more complicated. Some scripts can be written that you can create the entity, you can bring the file over that way, but sometimes you can't, and when that happens, you can pull everything. What I've done in the past is I've pulled all the body content out into a spreadsheet and then used an Excel formula to pull out the images. So I pulled the images out into a separate spreadsheet. So I had a list of all the files so that I could migrate those in, so that when I migrate the body content in, the files will already exist in the system. Does that make sense? Okay. It's complicated, I know. All right. Well, then I do have some helpful resources. This spreadsheet the whole slide presentation's on the Drupal GovCon site, so you can download them there. And I do have 2 links. One of them is to the migration mapping spreadsheet. This is a blank spreadsheet, so you can use it as a template for building out mapping your own migrations. There's also a link to Screaming Frog, which is the site crawler that I like to use. Okay.